Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar of today of the World Wealth Survey. I'm Christian Herpf, I'm the president of the World Wealth Survey, and we have the pleasure to have as our speaker today Professor Patrizia Giustino. She is a development economist who works at the interface between development economics on the one hand and political science on the other. She's a leading expert on political violence and development and the co-founder and co-director of the Households in Conflict Network. She's currently deputy director at UNU WIDER and professorial fellow at the Institute for Development Studies, IDS, in Brighton, United Kingdom. Professor Giustino's research focuses on the relationship between political violence, institutional transformation, governance, and development outcomes. She has led major research programs funded by the European Commission, the UK Economic and Social Research Council, ESRC, and the UK Department of International Development, DFID. She is currently the director of an ESRC large grant project, which is very prestigious and important, on the relationship between inequality, social trust, and governance outcomes. Professor Giustino's research has been published in leading international journals, such as the Journal of Development Economics, the Journal for Conflict Resolution, the Journal of Peace Research, and the World Bank Economic Review. And she is the lead author of a book with Oxford University Press with the title A Micro-Level Perspective on the Dynamics of Conflict, Violence and Development. She has held several advisory positions in major international organizations, including ActionAid, DFID, FAO, UNDP, UNESCO, UNICEF, UN Women, USAID, and the World Bank. She was also the director of the Microcon Research Program and deputy director of the TAMNIAC Initial Training Network. Professor Giustino holds an MPhil in economics from the University of Cambridge in Britain and a PhD in economics from the University of London, also in Great Britain. She has held visiting positions at Harvard University between 2007 and 2009 and the European University Institute in Italy 2017, among many others. Patrizia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real pleasure. We were just having a little chat before on how important this data set has been in terms of allowing research of various types, and we took full advantage of it at the UN. I should also say that from the 1st of May, I will be the director of UNU WIDER, and I look forward to continue the collaboration if possible. What we did here, what I'm going to talk about is the World Social Report 2025. UNDESA, the Department for Economic Affairs of the United Nations, produces every year this report. And in 2025, we joined forces. It's the first time that UNDESA joined forces with another agency to produce this report. And we joined forces to talk about a topic very close to everyone's heart and at the absolute center of what's happening at the UN at the moment, in the world, what explains a lot of the geopolitical changes we're seeing, which is a social trust. And we struggled for quite a while thinking about how we're going to approach this, and the World Value Survey was the answer to some of these discussions. So this is a really flagship report produced by the UN. It's prefaced and by the Secretary General, so he had full support at the highest possible levels of the UN. And we are very thankful for the work you do in putting together these data sets. Otherwise, this would never have been possible. I'm going to bring here what I'm going to go into a bit more detail here than the report itself on the issue of social trust. This is what I'm going to focus the discussion. And if for those of you that are more interested, and here, if you're more interested in how we use the World Value Survey, how we combine it with other data sets, yeah, anything more technical that anyone might be interested, I call your attention to this working paper by UNIWIDER, which was the main background paper for the report. And there, everything is explained in much more detail than what I'll be able to do during the seminar, or even what the World Social Report contains. So for those of you that want more detail, the UNIWIDER paper will be much more useful. And what we did is we compiled all available barometer data for Europe, the European Social Survey, Latin America, Africa, plus the World Value Survey. We didn't match them. We used them in different ways when possible. And we tried to get information between 2005 and 22-23. I believe this is one of the very first times this analysis on social trust covers both developed and developing countries. And we wanted to focus on the impact. So our main hypothesis for the report and the paper is that social trust has gone into a different lower equilibrium since the financial crisis of 2007-2008. So we wanted to look at what has happened since the Great Recession of 2007 and 8, when we start observing really large drops in trust across the world. And that's more or less what kind of drives the report. I'll come back to that in a minute. And we focus very much on outcomes, on what does it all mean of what we call the trust crisis. And we look at the impact on political participation and civic engagement, perceived levels of corruption, social political stability, and media transparency. And this is where we do match the World Value Survey with other data sets. I'll come back in a minute. On the report itself, so this is on the data that is not part of the World Value Survey. This is data that's compiled by UNDESA. So the report starts with this observation that despite progress in many social indicators, 60% of people today regard life worse or the same as compared to 50 years ago. And there are two stories that come. One is a story about insecurity, about employment instability and the risk of falling into poverty. And another is a story of very high levels of economic inequality and reversal of trends in many parts of the world where social exclusion continues to persist. But then at the heart of it all, and I'm not going to make any judgments about causality, we are not able to establish any form of causality using these data, as you probably well know. What we can observe is at the heart of it all is this issue of increased social fragmentation, increased polarization, and mistrust across the world. And that's what we set up to try to understand. We take a very standard definition of trust, and that trust is the expectation that others will act in ways that are beneficial or at least not harmful for us. This is pretty standard definition. And we look both at institutional trust and interpersonal trust. So institutional trust is issues around confidence in governments, courts, police, etc. But we also look at interpersonal trust, so confidence in others. And there we make a differentiation between those that are closer to us, so family, neighbors, etc., and those that are stranger to us. And the headline of this work is both institutional and interpersonal trust are eroding at different levels and in different places, but this is what we find concerning, because there's not a great deal of information up to the early 2000s, but certainly not across the entire world. But generally, we know that when institutional trust decreases, and there are ups and downs, usually it gets compensated by changes in the interpersonal trust, whereby communities get together, say a shock. We saw that during the pandemic, for instance, with the COVID pandemic, where there was a reduction in trust in governments and institutions, especially in certain parts of the world, but communities came together and somehow a collective action was possible. But what we're observing across the world is actually a reduction in both, which of course should be of concern. And for the United Nations in particular is of concern because we do believe that some of the discourse and narratives that we observe about lack of trust in multilateral systems is explained by reductions in trust at national levels, which accumulates then to what we see happening in the world today. This is the sort of global estimate that we have, and this uses the World Value Survey. And the graph shows the levels of trust across the world. The green one is Parliament, the red one is government, and then I couldn't resist adding the United Nations, which apparently is not doing as badly as we'd expect compared to everything else. But we see especially in the executive, confidence in the executive is decreasing. But what's more, these numbers are in themselves quite large. But what struck us most is actually looking at the zeros, the people that claim or people that report having no trust whatsoever in their governments, and in around 2022-23, that was 1/4 of the world's population has no trust in their governments, which is quite a high jump since, for instance, 2005, which was about 16%. And we did so we did quite a lot of work here trying to bring in the story of low-income countries as well. And what we did is we separated the countries into high, low, and middle-income countries according to the World Bank's definition. And here, interesting story. We find that low-income countries are more trusting of their governments overall. We can ask questions about that and about how that question is asked, etc. And I'm sure there will be questions about that. But certainly overall, it's the low-income countries are also the ones where we see larger losses in trust over time. And by over time, I mean since 2005. And if we look, so here we move to the barometer data. So we try to compare to see what the barometer data for different continents will give us. And we find a similar story. I mean, countries, well, it depends on how you want to define this, but countries in Africa are those where traditionally you have higher levels of trust, but large decreases in trust. Europe, you see a decrease in just the post 2007-8 financial crisis, but a recovery. Latin America, you see a steady decrease, especially since the financial crisis, but then an interesting recovery post-COVID, and that's something I think people are still investigating about what happened there, but that seems to be quite consistent. There are some researchers suggesting this has to do with the fact that Latin American governments were very quick at implementing social policies to counteract the COVID pandemic, but there are different theories about why there is that rebound in Latin America. But the decrease in Africa is pretty consistent and quite dramatic. In terms of interpersonal trust, we observe that things are much more stable and it looks much more resilient, but it's quite uneven. And certainly, as you'd expect, higher level of trust are amongst those that we know best, and that's being kept pretty consistent across decades, with slight reductions, especially in high and middle income countries, around trust in those that you don't know very well. But the story is quite uneven across. What we do need is globally about 27% of people, about a quarter of the world population trusted others. But this is more or less, historically, this is more or less been a stable number. Now, the big story that we find, so we try to look at various levels of what has been driving these reduction, etc. So, as I said, the paper contains much more information, but let me just highlight one story that we find quite consistently is about generational gaps in mistrust levels. And here we computing mistrust, not trust, so those that do not trust their governments. And if you see, it becomes very clear that those are born in the 1990s, the baseline, so the first dots that you see in the graph are the sort of starting points, the starting points of that generation mistrust in their governments. Those born in the 1990s start a much higher level of mistrust than any other generation before. This is cohort analysis, and it's steady. Younger generations tend increasingly to lack trust. And I should say this is for institutional trust. And we do, in this occasion, find quite similar results also for interpersonal trust. But it's those born in the 1990s that really is the big jump here in the story is that shows quite a very, very large mistrust in government. Which then, in other work that we've done, we have linked to issues around disfranchisement, low attendance of participation in elections of young generations, and so forth. But that's perhaps something for another presentation. I don't have time to go into much detail, but we looked at what are the forces that may be behind this erosion of trust. Five things come to the five great outcomes. One is inequality, other is economic security, and especially amongst households that are really close to the poverty line. Governance is a big part of the story. It's about accountable and legitimate institutions needed to build trust. Crisis, both the financial crisis and the COVID crisis had large impacts on trust, although the rebound from the COVID crisis seems to have been quicker than from the financial crisis. And then things that are a little bit more difficult to measure, but are taken into account in the WVS survey around perceptions of justice, issues around fairness, to put in another word. People do have a feeling that the world has become unfair. And that goes hand in hand with lack of trust in institutions. Just to give you an idea, this is the correlations with trust and income inequality. The colors, the green color represent high income countries, the red one low income countries, and the blue one middle income countries. So we try to separate them. There's not a big story around levels of income on trust in government. There's a bigger correlation you see in trust in interpersonal trust, but the correlation in both cases is negative, and it is all of this is they are statistically significant results. Now moving away from the World Value Survey data, this is the barometer data that adds a bit more nuance to the story. And what we do find in general, that trust responds, yes, to income inequality directly, but actually the biggest correlation that we see is how people perceive their income situation and how governments address these economic vulnerabilities, and essentially how governments redistribute. So it's an evaluation of governments' redistributive policies, and that seems to be explaining quite a large part of the correlation between trust and inequality. And this is, again, to give you a flavor. We do these for a number of settings in the paper. Now, we did the mandate we had with UNDESA was to look at what are the consequences of this declining trust. This is what the sort of senior management of the UN was most interested in. Why does this matter? Why an agency or the two agencies that have a mandate on economic research are suddenly looking around issues around trust? Does it matter for what we do? And the answer, well, it matters at many, many levels. It matters in terms of social cohesion. we find that low levels of trust weakens civic cooperation and increases political, in particular political polarization. There's issues around the social contracts. Mistrust reduces tax compliance as one of the is one of the most visible aspects of it, but there are other less things that are outcomes that are more difficult to measure, but this is quite clear. Stability, distrust goes hand in hand with increase in protests, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think I come back to that in a minute. But also an increase in political violence as well. And then in terms of corruption, and this is a big story of the report, lack of trust goes hand in hand with increases in corruption or perceived corruption. And there's also a narrative around mistrust and disinformation, the spread of disinformation, biases in media, etc. Now, to do this analysis, we matched the World Value Survey with the VDEM dataset, which is a dataset, presumably, I don't know how many are familiar, but includes very detailed information on a whole series of variables that follow different outcomes that matter for democracy, for the evolution of democracy. And it provides really valuable insights into why this declining of trust matters. So we brought these data sets together to have a look. Again, no claims here about causality. This could very well go in a different direction as well. We are doing much more work. We've started a new project at UNEWIDER where we're going to look at some of these issues. The point of this report was to actually, raise awareness at the higher levels of the UN and other international organizations about the fact that this is an issue that really is important and we need to pay attention to. So that's the point of this report. But then we're doing now much more detailed work about some of these issues. But this is what we have in the report. This is an area where I think a lot more research needs to be done, but we see a very clear correlation between institutional mistrust and increases in mass mobilization during the period that we're looking at. I should say that all the graphs I'm showing you now are for the latest World Value Survey, the 2002, 2003, whatever, the period of the latest wave. We've repeated these for all waves and we get quite similar results, but it is in the latest wave that we see the most, the strongest negative correlations. And this is one case. We see lower levels of institutional trust associated with higher levels of mass mobilization. And interesting, this trend is driven by countries where institutional trust decreased the most since 2005. And it seems to indicate that institutional trust may have led to higher levels of collective action. These are not necessarily violent movements. Most of these are actually protests like Black Lives Matter, the women's protests across Europe, and the COVID protests as well that happen across many parts of the world. So it seems that as trust starts reducing or gets to these low levels, actually collective mobilization has increased in terms of people demanding more of their governments. So it's not necessarily that we see, this is not a story of violence, this is actually a story of collective action. So people have not been passive while these different movements have been happening across the world. And we see similar results for institutional trust, but weaker also because the change is not so dramatic. In terms of corruption, this is a very clear story. And countries with the highest level of, I show here the result for interpersonal trust just to vary, but it's quite almost the same for institutional trust. They have the highest CPI, and this is the corruption perception index. which is measured the lowest levels. So the highest CPI indicates lower level of corruption. It becomes a bit confusing. So the more you see, the green countries are those that actually have low levels of corruption and high levels of trust. And almost all of those are high-income countries. Here, the income variable becomes very clear. There's a bit of a mix along for middle income and low-income countries, but the strongest correlation is amongst high-income countries. The outlier in all graphs is China, and China consistently shows very high levels of trust in institutions, and others, I think we can discuss that maybe in the Q&A, because I think there's a reason to explain some of these results, and may have to do with what is the data actually telling us in some of these countries. I do say that we did some separate analysis, and we find almost perfect correlation between high levels of institutional trust and autocracies. So it also comes with it, and it's actually good to have this discussion here amongst this group, because I presume you've seen that in the data, and you probably have better explanations than I do for this, but the correlation is there. And in terms of political stability, again, I show the results for trust in other people. This is one of the few instances where the results are actually stronger for interpersonal trust and institutional trust. For violent mobilization, interpersonal trust seems to matter more. And we see a clear correlation between the two. And political instability here is essentially high levels of violence and conflict. And here again, the income divide shows very clearly that in countries, high-income countries, have observed a much more positive correlation than others. Now, media transparency, given all that we know is happening in the world, this was an interesting thing. Now, the VDEM dataset doesn't really have a very clear measure of media bias. They do it in 5 or 6 different ways, and it's very difficult to interpret these results. So here we take them with a bit of a pinch of salt. Again, a very clear income divide. Again, a negative correlation between in this case, we chose a measure of media freedom, which we interpret to mean transparency. And we see, and the result is very clear. Here, the relationship with institutional trust is also very similar. But this is probably the result I'm less confident in, because I'm not quite sure how to interpret some of these media variables. I don't know if someone here is from the VDEM dataset or knows it very well. Maybe you can help us thinking through how best to measure this. I'm sure there's an important narrative here, which also feeds into the story about social mobilization, but we need to get a better handle of these. But this is what we see. And essentially, what do we want to say? Now, as an economist, I find all these results extremely interesting, because for a long time, we get trained to think about social trust or other norms as pretty persistent across time. Plenty of studies that trace the origins of trust back to colonial times, and fairly stable levels of trust across decades. This decrease that we're observing now, especially in institutional trust, doesn't seem to be going away, and it's been there already for 20 good years. It seems so. One of the hypotheses that we're taking forward now in a new study that we're going to start at UNEWA is the question: are we in a new equilibrium of trust? So if we do believe that social norms, including trust, are persistent across time, did we just observe a reduction of it that might become a new equilibrium? And if we can't move to the higher levels we observed before, are we going to see the consequences becoming forming a vicious cycle, which is what we have there in red? Because we know with lower levels of trust, we know we're going to see increases in polarization. We're already seeing this across the world, in Europe, in the US, voting outcomes, extreme parties coming to power, etc. Disengagement of voters, weaker social life, although that we're not seeing yet, higher levels of corruption, tax avoidance, therefore lack, almost a breakdown of the social contract. And if this is this low equilibrium, then there is a danger that that's what we'll continue seeing is the vicious cycle. Whereas maybe before, for a few decades, we actually benefited from the blue cycle, the virtuous cycle, where a higher level of trust led to a series of good outcomes. And in this situation with trust, usually bad outcomes go with bad outcomes and good outcomes go with good outcomes. So is this what explains what the situation we're seeing across the world in so many parts of the world is? That are we now in the red cycle? And if yes, how do we get out of it? We have very prescriptive policy recommendations in the report, because what this really means is a rethinking of social contracts. If this is the case, if this is where we are in the red cycle, then we have to really seriously rethink social contracts across the world. What should we do to get from the red cycle to the blue cycle? We know this research has been around for decades. We need strong institutions. We need equity and redistribution and support of citizens for redistributive policies. We need a strong civil society. We need unbiased media. We need global cooperation. We need multilateralism. The problem here is to achieve all these, we also need social trust. If there is no trust, in particular trust between citizens and states, if that trust breaks, these policies, the trust is effectively endogenous to all these policies. And so what can we do then to get out of the situation is a much more profound discussions and much more profound changes than just this tweaking at the margins type situation. We really are looking at national social contracts and the social contracts between different member states and multilateral agencies as well. And that indicates that trust is more than just a cultural trait or a social norm. It actually can be built, and therefore, it can be broken, but therefore can also be built by policy choices. So it becomes a choice at the end rather than a policy prescription. And we do know that if governments take action, trust tends to rebuild, but it does take time to come back from the kind of reductions that we're observing across the world at the moment. So I stop here because I think it'll be very interesting to have input from everyone in this group as well, given how we've used the data, and this is also a great time to have this discussion. Like I mentioned, we're going to start a new program of research at UNUIDA on the consequences of trust and how do we think through policy interventions that could get us out of the red cycle into the blue cycle. So it's going to take us a few years to do that. So any input at this stage would be most welcome. And I don't know if anyone has a mobile phone there, but you could get the full working paper from the QR code here. So thank you so much, and I look forward to discussing further.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for this very interesting talk. Also, we are always pleased to see that our data are useful and helping international organizations to produce the reports and policy recommendations. Now we have a Q&A session. You can either raise your hand or indicate on your screen that you want to talk, or you can write on chat. So there are two ways to talk with Patricia. So I think the first question on the chat was by Stefan Peterson. What are the confidence intervals around the point estimates? And the second question is Amalia Prado-Metza. How about the role of social media use and the role of political knowledge? And Amelia Prado-Metza has another question. In public opinion literature, since the turn of the century, political information and knowledge is associated with civic engagement. Focusing on political information might make sense on the what to do end rather than trying to make people more trusting, since in many countries healthy skepticism is more warranted. So these are so far the comments, and then we have two hands raised. As the first hand is Yali, and the second hand is Daniel Moreno. Yali, please.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for this presentation. I'm always fascinated by the trust issue. So first I had a question on in the first part of your presentation. I'm sorry if I missed that, but why didn't we have North America? Was it on purpose or just a data issue? And if we did, how would that impact your overall views? The second one is more a comment from my experience, because I was a financial reporter for 20 years, and in Europe, in France, Brussels, and then in Washington, D.C. for 12 years, and then in Canada for 5 years. And across the three continents, my media press always depended on the government, and that gives any government the ability to take it away from you, even in countries that are really well known for democracy. And so I think that it's an important factor for me to take into account when you assess things, because yes, it's free press, but the reality is also, if you are not, if you're not considered, it depends, like maybe you're not with a big agency, or maybe you're not saying the things that they like to hear, then, you can not be invited, for instance. And so those are very subtle things that I find very overlooked in debates in democracies, and this impacts also what you can read in the media, obviously. So that was just a comment from my experience.
Thank you, Daniel. The last for this first round is Daniel. Daniel is the PI of the WVS survey. He's one of the guys producing the data you are using. Daniel, please.
Thank you, Christian. Hello, Patricia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. I have a quick question, comment. You show us this very clear relationship between trust and things like media bias, corruption, political stability, social mobilization. And you also show this clear relationship between trust and levels of economic development. And we know that economic development is also strongly related with the strength and the quality of democracy. What if the whole relationship is there, or mostly there? I mean that what explains trust is the level of democratic development, and not necessarily that trust explains media bias, corruption perception, political stability, and so on and so forth. In other words, how can we support empirically the causal relationship that puts trust on the right side of the equation? That we explain these other things. You say that trust is important because of all these things, but what if it's only or mostly a result of a deeper development process that includes a democratic development, and not a variable that can be treated independently? And also, if you look at the when you look at the data at the more individual level, it's not that easy to find these clear relationships that you find at the aggregate level when using country average data. So why doesn't trust work in the same way at the individual level, and it works at the aggregate level in terms of the statistical relationships that you have shown us? Maybe it has to do with that broader development concept that includes democracy. And one additional thing, can we really talk about one trust? Is trust in institutions the same conceptually as trust in other people, as interpersonal trust? Is trust in the government the same as trust in institutions? Maybe we have to, I'm not sure. I'm asking because I generally don't know the answer to this, but maybe it's not just one concept, but there are different things as they show different ways in which people relate to the state and to other individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Maybe Patricia should have the chance to answer the first round. Please.
Okay, let me go through a few, maybe not all of them, because some of them overlap as well. There was a lot about social media. Someone asked about social media use. We couldn't disaggregate the data. The global data sets didn't allow us to disaggregate about social media per se. That's why we're a bit uncertain about what we're saying about the media story. This is freedom of media overall, but I think it's traditional media rather than what use of social media. This is one of the things we couldn't really do because we couldn't get very good global estimates. Yeah, if anyone has any knowledge of a variable that could be used globally at that level, I would really appreciate. I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that. What is the question? Is it Eurocentric political information knowledge associated with civic engagement? Exactly, on the public opinion literature, that's exactly what we see. So the reduction in trust seems to actually lead people to demand more of their governments. People came to the streets. If you remember, very large protests happened during the COVID pandemic, and before that, the very large protests were happening to do with the women's movements, with Lives Black Matters, but all. They had different labels, but it's all about the same. It was about growing injustices. So if anything, the relationship goes the other way around. Is as people distrust the governments, they come out to demand more of them. And I think that's something that's the one result where there's a sliver of hope there, is somehow the citizens have not given up. They're not trusting their governments in overall and globally, etc., but they haven't given up in trying to improve situations. And yes, healthy skepticism is a good thing. But I think here we're seeing much more than just healthy skepticism. We're actually seeing that a lot of people in a lot of countries are angry about the fact that lives have not been improving. And I think that's overall what we're seeing. Then the question about the freedom of press. Exactly, Yali. That's there's so much nuance about what does it mean to be what does it mean, this variable of media freedom? We look at this variable is defined as transparency, the media being overall transparent about what they do. But the underlying nuances about what this actually does mean, it's lacking. Therefore, we get very mixed results on the overall media. We used all 5 or 6 variables that the VDEM dataset has on media, and we get very muddled results. And I think the reason why we get those muddled results is precisely because it's not so clear what this all means, and whether freedom of media freedom actually means total freedom to broadcast whatever you want, because obviously that's not the reality. So I think that's why we get these muddled results. We need to look in, these are global estimates. So to look at mechanisms is what the next step would be. So we would need to find out we would need to run at least some basic regressions to figure out if we can eliminate some other correlates and have a much cleaner estimate of what this all means. But it's very hard. I suspect this analysis can only be done at national level, not at this global level, because the variables just are not telling us what they're supposed to be telling us. So this is just a long way to say that you're absolutely right, and that's why I don't really trust the story very much there. Then we ask ourselves, so this is Daniel, we ask ourselves very long and hard, is this all about economic development or about democracy? Like I said, now, two things discredit that. The first is, although some of the results are very clear about high-income countries, so European countries, Latin, North American countries, etc., US and Canada, the results are not so straightforward when you look at middle-income and low-income countries. That's where there's no correlation between income and various variables at all. So we know, and there's a good reason why a lot of the research so far has focused on Europe and North America, research on trust. And there we know good things go with good things. We know that it's very well established. But when you go down to high middle income countries, the story is not straightforward at all. It's not explained by democracy. It's not explained. What we do find is high level, like I mentioned before, high levels of institutional trust go alongside with autocracies as well as they go alongside democracies. The correlations are equally strong. We reckon that in the case of autocracies, I mean, you're the guys that go to the field and ask people these questions, but I suspect that in the case of autocracies, and China comes out as a very strong result, I think people are just conditioned to answer that, yes, the governments, they have strong confidence in their governments. So you get these polar results, high levels of institutional trust, both in democracies and in autocracies. And I think people have written quite a lot about that. So it's not like we found, this is not a new result for us, but they tell us that it's not a story about democracy at all, because autocracies also are relying on very high levels of trust. Whether those are real or not, I think you probably know more about that than I do. But so this thing, the fact that we find these bipolar results, democracy and autocracy, and we find no correlation, so the income variable stops explaining anything once you remove all the high income countries. So there is other variables are coming into play, and it's not about GDP levels at all, or economic growth, or we've measured this in huge varieties of ways, GDP, equivalent incomes. We've measured this in a variety of ways, and it disappears completely once you remove all the high income countries. I have forgotten, someone asked about North America is in the data. Canada and the US are there in the World Value Survey. What I meant is when we use the barometer data, we use the LAPOP data set in the Latin America barometer, which does include the US as far as I remember. I can't quite remember now. But for the World Value Survey, we use the entire sample, whatever it is available for in each year, that's what we use. We didn't constrain the sample. We did lots of analysis by keeping the same number of countries in the data across the years, etc. But the results that I'm showing here are just the raw results without any messing with the samples. It's just the raw samples. So we didn't remove any countries. If you do remove countries like China and Tajikistan and so forth, you do get slightly different results, but that's because of the nature of these high levels of trust in these countries. Individual level versus global level, I can't answer that question. I haven't done a great deal of work at the individual level, except for Latin America. There we don't see huge amounts of disparity between national level results and individual results, but maybe I'm missing something. And the question about one trust, that's a very interesting question. That's exactly, so in this report, we differentiate in what three measures of trust for all purposes. One is institutional trust, where we aggregate all measures of all institutions, governments, parliaments, presidents, police, etc. That's what you have in the data set. And then we disaggregate between interpersonal trusts amongst those that are close to us and those that are further away from us. So trust in others, what's sometimes called generalized trust in the literature. We did try levels of disaggregation. And we know, for instance, that in some countries, trust in the police behaves in a very different way from trust in government. The truth here is that we just didn't have the time or the scope to disaggregate at this level. This was supposed to be a global report. But it's very possible to all disaggregate that. The one that comes to my mind is in a lot of cases, trust in police and in the coercive capacity of the state does behave in different ways from trust in parliaments and governments. And often in some of the calculations, we remove those institutions from the analysis to see if something would be different. And we couldn't see any obvious pattern. But this is one of those questions that has to be answered maybe more at regional or national level, rather than global level, because it's hard to see global patterns on those. But it really matters what is the underlying variable. And it does seem that a lot of the reduction in trust in institutions has to do with the executive part of the government. And that's the main observation that we can make at this stage. But then the different countries have different government structures, so it's also very difficult to disaggregate much more if you're trying to come up with global estimates. But that's the work for the next project. I think I more or less covered most. Please tell me if I didn't. Yes.
No, I think you answered all the questions. We have also in our webinar the principal investigator of the weather survey for Mongolia, Bilek Seven, and she is very happy about your talk. And she said she finds your trends also in Mongolia. So if you have to talk about individual level, you can contact Tsetsem, and she will tell you how the indicators are working in Mongolia.
Right.
And yes, that's brilliant. And Claretta Traeger, thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting, very clear. And she's now switching off. So we have 5 minutes left, but we don't have to fill it. But maybe some last words. I have to look at the chat. Yeah. There's lots to do for you, and we have just finished the project on trust in Europe, and we did a big study on trust in politics and trust in because there is one colleague was correct. You have the horizontal trust between neighbors and neighborhoods and village. This is horizontal trust. But then the trust institution is vertical trust. How much you trust the government, the president. So it's a different level, and one should not mix it in one battery in one indicator if possible. But you don't do this, so I'm not blaming you.
Yeah.
And I just say there are several dimensions of trust which has to be considered, and we did last year, 6 months ago, a trust survey in 24 European countries. So if someone's interested, please talk to Xenia. The data set is available as a public good. All right.
Right.
There was
it would
one.
be great to see those reports. Yes, I'll definitely look up for that. Yes.
Yes. So we
Yeah.
are producing books and publications on this, and we'll keep you
That
posted
would be
accordingly.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yes, super great. And this data are brand new. We have brand new data from summer 25 for Germany, France, etc., etc.
Yeah, I saw some of the countries had more. It's just we had to finish. The report is already from last year. But yes, yeah.
No, we haven't even started. We did it, the field work,
Aha.
and we got the data set in autumn, and now we start analyzing it ourselves. So, but just a warning, this is coming your way if you're interested.
Absolutely. I would love to see more of this. Yes, I'll keep an eye out, please. And if you have
Yes,
anything to share, that would be very welcome. Like I say, we're starting this new project on trust. So anything new, especially new measures that are out there, that would be great.
yes. I think Jani, you want to say something?
Yes, just one last question, and maybe you can answer now, but I've noticed in research a growing amount of surveys and things that are based on synthetic persona. Synthetic. So I was wondering if this is something that you are using, or how are you addressing that? Like, when you look at data and you look at things, what do you do with this? I saw Ipsos, has even created a whole offer and other polling companies. So I was curious about how you're using that, if you are at all.
We're not. No, we stayed away from that. Yeah, the data sets that we used was the World Virus Survey, and then what we tried to do is to see whether the same patterns we could observe them also in the barometer data sets. So the Asia one was very difficult to match, but the other ones we more or less, especially the African one, was very clear that we were seeing the same results. So that's all we did, was to see whether the World Value Survey more or less matched also with what we would see regionally. That's it. We didn't use any other, and we didn't use any synthetic data at all.
Okay, and generally speaking,
Yeah,
no. Okay.
not using
I'm
much
just
of
curious
that.
to see what people
We're doing,
are
I mean,
adopting right now, and I know it's been
there is some. Some of my colleagues here of my research unit are using a bit of synthetic data, but mostly on microsimulation modeling, so not at this global level. No.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you are interested in doing new survey, the European Social Survey has in every wave, I think, 2 modules which are for free, but you have to win it. You have to submit your module and send it to London, and then there's a competition, of course. But if you are one of these two winners, then your questions can be tested at the European level. If you need a team of researchers who are supporting this, of course.
That's good
Just
to
a,
know.
just
Thank
a,
you.
just a tip, because it's for free if you win.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I did not know. Yeah, thank you.
The Rory Fitzgerald, the director, is we can talk with him. Dr. Zenka Mansfeldova is a leading cell researcher also here in the group, and she thank you for this interesting lecture. And also Hilary Graham, thanks you for the great presentation. So you have very good feedback.
Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure.
So we have 1 minute left. So thank you very much. Patricia, you want to have a last word?
No, just to say, everyone, thank you and also thank you for the great questions. And any new information that you might have on research on trust, please, it will be very welcome. And anyone interested in the UN wider project, also please email me. Very, very happy to collaborate also if there's interest in the group.
Please write to Patricia or to Xenia, and Xenia will forward it to Patricia, and we can take it from there. Thank you very much for coming, despite the Easter break. You all have very short Easter holidays, obviously, and have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.